Hello, and welcome to the Brave New Weed podcast. And now, here's your host, Joe Dolce.
Welcome to the Brave New Weed podcast. I sort of want to subtitle it from now on, the most interesting conversations with the most interesting people in the cannabis business and industry and world. I think we are officially in the post-prohibition era, not legally, but I think what's happening in the world and what's happening in cannabis and the fact that Canada is legalizing nationally on October 17th makes it a different world. And we are officially in post-prohibition. The United States will catch up eventually and things will move forward. So welcome to the most interesting conversations with the most interesting people in the world of cannabis. And one of those people is Matthew Hendershot. How are you, sir?
Joe, I am doing absolutely great. Thanks for having me back on the show. Greetings from Leipzig, Germany,
where you now live. So we are now an international podcast, and I'm very curious to hear our German friends' response to what we're doing here on the Brave New Weed cast. Matthew, there's so much to talk about. Can we just jump right into the news very soon?
Absolutely. Let's do it. So, Joe, first up for news, let's jump back to something that we talked about last week, which was the upcoming vote on Proposition 2 in the state of Utah. We talked about the official statement of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which, just for brevity, let's start referring to as LDS. And they had come out...
Not LSD, LDS.
LDS. Also not Mormons, where we should respect their wish to no longer be referred to as Mormons. So
Absolutely.
LDS, they initially came out and said everybody votes no on Prop 2 because it's against our dogmatic rules, right? And then a sort of underground campaign of billboards started popping up that we discussed last week, which basically said... the opposite, that said, these teachings of the Book of Mormon actually go the other way. And now that that's all taken place, the Utah-based faith has flipped on their stance.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, they had a slight problem in that LDS members they don't use caffeine, they don't use alcohol, they don't use tea, they don't use any stimulant, they don't use tobacco. So they were considering cannabis in that category, but then they came up with this idea that their Bible allows plants to be used for healing properties. So they had a little philosophical chasm that they had to cross, but good for them for progressing.
Yeah, so as you said, the Utah-based faith had initially opposed the ballot measure, basically over fears that it could lead to more broad use. We discussed the billboards and the doctrine that states basically all wholesome herbs God hath ordained for use of man. Now, church leadership and state lawmakers have come to a compromise over the upcoming Prop 2 vote. The global leader, Jack Gerard, now says that the LDS Church is thrilled to be a part of the effort to alleviate human pain and suffering, but their fear is still that Proposition 2 doesn't do enough to protect communities from exposure to growing use and potential abuse. We put this out a little bit last week, and we actually got contacted by a listener to the show, Cade from Utah. Cade reached out to us, heard our story, and shared more insight from the ground, from the state, from his local city, from his own family, who he was raised very strict Mormon family, and they even had split thinking on the issues. So it breaks down basically like this: the church and Mr. Gerard recently took the opportunity at their global general conference to broadcast to its members that God actually condones cannabis use for legitimate medical purposes. This is functionally now to local churches and area churches like a Supreme Court decree, right? So now everybody's on board with the idea that medical marijuana is a good thing. However, the church itself still thinks that Proposition 2 doesn't go far enough. So what they've done is they're partnering with lawmakers in the state, and they've agreed to a special session. So no matter what happens on the vote for Prop 2, this special session will either amend the law if it does pass or rewrite a new law if it fails.
Good. I like that headline. God condones marijuana use.
That's really strong statement to make. Of course, the LDS population in Utah and its related branches total about 64% of the entire population of the state. So it's likely that the ballot measure will fail because they're still saying vote no on Proposition 2.
There are many, many issues to be discussed with Mormons and marijuana. Let's see what happens, and then we'll go further as we go forward. Okay, so the second news item occurs just after Canada has legalized, which is a historic event again, as we just said. What's the news on this one?
Well, a lot of people are getting ready for, or now that it's legal, are trying to figure out how they're going to transition into this new world in Canada. And the news story that I've picked out here is that Vancouver police officers are free to smoke pot so long as they arrive fit for duty, according to the Vancouver Police Board.
Now, that's in Vancouver.
Yeah, that's in Vancouver, Canada. Officers will be asked to adhere to a 24-hour prohibition before any of their shifts, but they can carry it on them at work, and they can use it in their own recreational time. This is in stark contrast to a neighbor, also in Western Canada, Calgary, which is like completely off limits, right? They said
the Canadian system. Yeah, the Canadian system's sort of like the American, whatever you call this system, in that each province can control and regulate how things are used. But you got to remember, Vancouver was the original place of compassion clubs many, many years ago in the 1990s. It was places of demonstrations against illegal cannabis. It's always had a very progressive, pro-cannabis leaning. So this makes sense, and it's very sensible, I think. It's basically saying that you can treat cannabis the same way you would treat alcohol, although the fact that you can carry cannabis on you, I don't think the Vancouver police are carrying their pint of Jack Daniels in their belts.
Yeah, right. But it makes a lot of sense. If you're a police officer, you kick off your shift, you can go to the bar and have a beer. But if beer's not your thing, you kick off your shift, roll it up, light it up.
This is called normalization. Our third news item regards an editorial that appeared in the New York Times recently by Neil Pollack. And the headline was something about, I'm an average dad and I'm a marijuana addict. Everybody read this article in the cannabis space. And basically Neil was saying, this is the dirty secret. I have been an addict for most of my adult life, and it is causing me all sorts of problems. And no one's talking about cannabis addiction, but it's a real thing. Matthew, how did you respond to that piece?
Well, I read through the piece, and there were several things in it that hit me as being quite bizarre. Not really aligned with what I know about cannabis use, especially things that we've talked about with like cannabis use disorders in past episodes. These sort of outbursts of violence, these sort of disconnected things that don't really align. And then also never really admitting to stopping. Not really talking about a use or a recovery plan for himself. Not really weighing in at all if he's gotten any better since he stopped using. These sort of things just kind of got brushed under the rug. And it did.
I thought it was sort of a brave piece. I thought, when fighting prohibition, a lot of people, myself included, as advocates, didn't really want to deal with some of the negative consequences, such as what I would call cannabis use disorder, not addiction, or my own experience was this illness called hyperemesis, which I was, puking for almost 2 years every time I used, and sort of very unpleasant and very unexplained. And it really started me thinking about, wait a second, once we get through the burdens of prohibition, when do we begin reckoning with some of the negative aspects? And I thought Neil's piece was an attempt to do that. You don't agree, right?
Well, I do agree. And I do think that it should be something that we do need to talk about all of the things involved. Obviously, cannabis use in various degrees is going to work better for others, and other people are going to have problems with it. But I think that, in what some people surmised as bravery from the article, other people start to get a little whiff of something else that starts with a B, a little bit of BS floating off of there. Because So I'm not really sure. I do think you are right. I do think we do need to talk about the negative sides of this, things that we do need to be prepared for and look out for. But I think that this article is actually more harmful to the normalization process than it is good, and I'm not alone in that.
So I will. I don't disagree with you, but I don't think we should look at everything through the lens of politics. And I think that is one of the another of the after effects of prohibition is that everything is seen as political. I think it's important to begin the honest dialogue and have people like Neil express himself. I've known people who've used cannabis every day for as long as he has, which is a number of like 30 years, and they function. They have a tolerance. It somehow, I don't know, quells their anxiety. It helps them. It helps them function in life. I also know people who've used cannabis every day and who can't string two sentences together, and they become very dysfunctional, sort of outliers in society. They're not productive. So I want to discuss that more over time. I don't want to be Debbie Downer here, but I do think it's a very important topic that really needs to happen. And since we're now in the age of honesty, let's all be honest.
Well, and this is what I will key off of here, Joe, is I think that the article has a big area that is very dishonest. And I'm not alone in that. And a big portion of it, and so I'll move in. One of the responses comes from somebody whom you actually know and have some experience with, which is Dr. Peter Grinspoon.
I like Peter very much. He's actually Lester Grinspoon's son. Lester was the original cannabis advocate. In the 1970s, he wrote a book called Marijuana Reconsidered, and he was a professor of psychiatry at Harvard, and it really changed his life. And as a matter of fact, Harvard didn't continue his tenure after that book came out. I interviewed Lester for my book, and I found him, I don't know, he must be 90 right now. He's an amazing human being, incredibly intelligent, and had his life really changed by that. So I'm really interested to hear what Peter has to say. Peter, I believe, himself was addicted to painkillers, correct?
Yeah, opiates. He actually ran himself afoul of the law. He was writing himself prescriptions for pain medication, yeah.
Okay, and he wrote a really good book about it. So you're going to be able to speak to him, and I'm really looking forward to hearing your interview.
That's right. So I've reached out to Peter after he tweeted the following in response to Neil's article. As a person in recovery who's worked with thousands of cannabis users, the story doesn't entirely ring true. Either A, alcohol was also involved, B, there was another psychopathology, or C, it's been overly dramatized for the New York Times. Cannabis alone wouldn't explain these behaviors. So I wanted to reach out to Dr. Grinspoon and give him more than 140 characters to sound off on exactly that topic. Welcome, Dr. Grinspoon, to the podcast. I really appreciate you taking the time to join us today and to give us your take on this op-ed that was ran in the New York Times from Neil Pollock. You were vocal on Twitter, coming out saying that your opinion of this matter is that there's more to this story. So I would like to give you more than 140 characters to analyze this and tell me what your response and ideas are about this opinion article.
Well, I've taken care of a lot of people as a primary care doctor, first of all, for 25 years. And second of all, as someone who's been interested in medical cannabis my whole life, I've taken care of a lot of people, both on the positive side, treating them with medical cannabis, and I've also treated cannabis use disorder. And there's no question that people can get in trouble with cannabis. I think that it's not nearly as prevalent as the addiction people say. I don't think that 9% of people get, quote unquote, addicted to cannabis. I think that people can get dependent on it, and rarely people can get addicted to it. That said, I've had a couple patients that I would say have been addicted to it. The shorthanded definition of addiction being continued use despite negative consequences. Unfortunately, I know a lot about addiction because 11 years ago, I came into recovery from opiate addiction. So that's something I could talk about at length. I don't think cannabis addiction is nearly as sort of devastating as opiate addiction. I don't think it hijacks your brain to nearly the same extent that drugs like opiates do, but it is a phenomenon that people do experience cannabis addiction. Now, reading the op-ed that you're citing, it didn't ring entirely true as someone who's suffered from addiction and as someone who's dealt with thousands of people who have been treated with, use, or have sometimes struggled with cannabis. I really think that when you break someone's tooth with a beer bottle, that sort of implies that alcohol is involved.
That's a very good point,
and
actually.
that
I didn't think about the fact that he does very much state that it was a fight in a bar and he hit a guy with a beer bottle. So that is very clear. I didn't even pick up on that.
Right. I mean, the person on too much cannabis would be hiding under the table, not clubbing someone with a beer bottle. It just doesn't seem plausible. Cannabis has never been shown to make people violent. I guess occasionally, if you have one of these rare, paranoid reactions, you could hypothetically become violent. But really, attacking someone with a beer bottle sounds like cannabis and alcohol, not just cannabis, or predominantly alcohol. It just doesn't seem plausible to blame it on the cannabis. And the same is true for, he said he dropped his pants in public. That sounds more like an alcohol-related activity than a cannabis-related activity. And the same with the insulting the Iraqi cultural minister, or these sound like very aggressive behaviors. And cannabis does not make you aggressive. It has other problems, certainly. And just the whole pattern and also yelling at people about the tickets that he got scalped that were fake, the whole pattern of very aggressive externalized behavior doesn't sound like the cases of cannabis misuse that I've heard in the past. It tends to make people quiet, introverted, maybe detached, maybe, keep to themselves too much. It doesn't make them aggressive and attack people. So I think that either there was some other psychopathology involved that wasn't mentioned in the article.
This would be something
B,
like what? Like a perpetually
a personality disorder or bipolar or something like that. Or B, alcohol or another substance could be involved. I think alcohol would explain all of these behaviors much more than cannabis. Or C, perhaps the story is a little bit, embellished for the New York Times. There's secondary gain. There's benefit to writing a really dramatic piece in the New York Times, especially if you're a writer. You get a lot of attention. You help sell books. Now, all of that said, I have no doubt that cannabis worsened whatever the problems he was experiencing. And quite certainly, or quite possibly, he was dependent on it. And I have no doubt that cannabis was a huge problem for him. I just didn't think it was authentic to blame all of these behaviors on cannabis and to call it cannabis addiction. And I'm really not at all convinced that he just stopped taking the cannabis and all of these problems went away. There must have been therapy, antidepressants, or some other treatment for the other substances and the other psychopathology. It just really doesn't seem like just cannabis explained all this, and just going to Marijuana's Anonymous would stop all of these behaviors. So I was a little bit skeptical. Now, I don't have access to his medical records, but I just was when I read it, I was just filled with skepticism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I got a very similar kind of initial read on it. And having gone back and read it a couple times, hearing people talk about it in the way that you are as well, I kind of get the same understanding that there's more to the story.
Right. And if I could add once more, I've spoken to about 200 people about it, and I would say the voting is 200 that this was embellished, 0 that this was a genuine story of someone struggling with solely cannabis, and then they quit the cannabis and all of these cannabis-related behaviors disappeared. It just is not plausible that cannabis does all of this. There was something else going on besides the cannabis. Maybe something as simple as just wanting to get attention. Again, I'm really glad that he's doing better, whatever the problem was. And again, I'm sure that the cannabis was not helping the situation, but it seems disingenuous to blame attacking someone in a bar with a beer bottle and breaking their tooth on cannabis doesn't do that. It doesn't make people aggressive in that way.
I do want to. I want to follow up. The reason why we're having this conversation is because I think with being such a prominent thing like the New York Times, it's important to, because this casts a very bad light on medical cannabis, especially, and something that we're trying to push into being medicine. All of a sudden, it's sort of really throwing some shade on it. But I think something I would like to ask you is, what can you tell us about what you actually have seen with cannabis use disorder, as far as the impacts to people and the things to maybe watch out for? Like, one of our listeners may be concerned that he has a problem, starting to ask that question of addiction. What are some of the warning signs or some of the results and effects that you have seen from genuine cannabis use disorder?
Well, it's interesting. Cannabis use disorder is defined very broadly. And I'm not sure the addiction people have it right in the way they've defined it, because some of the criteria have to do with, occupational and legal troubles. And some of that comes from it being illegal. So that, part of the criteria is sort of related to the fact that it's illegal. And now that it's going to be illegal, none of that will make sense anymore. And I think it's been defined too broadly. But generally speaking, people can get dependent on it. And, there's no limit to what people will do to escape reality, and to avoid responsibilities. And sure, cannabis is a great way to do that. So people do use it inappropriately. People can overuse it, and people can get very dependent on it. But, the way I define addiction is use despite negative consequences. So, if there's a very good reason to stop it and you can't stop it, then that's a good sign that you might be addicted to it. I know of someone who might have cannabis hyperemesis. They keep going to the ER every month, throwing up. They smoke cannabis every day. They've had every possible workup by the gastroenterologist. No one could figure out why they keep having these episodes of throwing up. I think they might have cannabis hyperemesis. I said to them, as their doctor, like, I'm not one of these anti-cannabis doctors by any means, but I think you should stop smoking for 6 months so that we can see if this is what's causing you to throw up, because you're going to the ER once or twice a month and it's miserable. You're staying overnight. You're getting IVs. You're just miserable. And my patient can't do it. They just literally can't stop smoking for long enough for us to figure out whether or not they even have this syndrome or not. And to me, that's continued use despite negative consequences. I mean, it just seems like if your doctor tells you stop smoking cannabis for a few months so we could see if that's what's causing you to go to the emergency room once or twice a month, and you can't stop, to me, that's continued use despite negative consequences. That's addiction. So some people do certainly get addicted. And just like any other addiction, it's very difficult to get them to stop.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point you make. If there's warning signs and indications that maybe you can take a break, but it's something preventing you from being able to actually put it down and walk away, then that is probably a good sign that there's a bigger issue.
Absolutely. I mean, it's really important to be able to tell if this is what's causing it, or if they have something else going on that needs to be evaluated. And you can't tell that until you get rid of all the other variables. And we just can't go the next step because we can't get rid of this variable because this patient can't stop smoking. And it's really inhibiting the progression of the diagnosis. And it just doesn't seem to me to be that big a deal to not smoke, not use cannabis for 3 to 4 months. But if this patient can't do it, that's really astounding. I mean, that's a sign of addiction. So for people who say that cannabis isn't addictive, I would use this as a perfect case that it certainly can be. I just don't think it's as addictive as the addiction people say it is. I think that a lot of people got labeled as cannabis addiction because, they were teenagers, they got in trouble, the parents and the kids were brought up in front of the judge and they said, would you rather go to juvie or get treatment? And they said, of course, I'd rather get treatment. And they needed a diagnosis. So it was called cannabis addiction. But a lot of these people didn't have cannabis addiction. They had, I don't want to get in trouble from the judge. So they got cannabis addiction. So I think it's like vastly exaggerated the kind of extent of cannabis addiction. I think most of it's really dependence, but I think it does exist and it can be difficult to treat. I think the most exciting opportunity to treat it, the most exciting thing is CBD. I think people are using CBD and finding it very effective for cravings, for withdrawal. So I've been using higher dose CBD in patients and having some success.
And that sounds like a story that we could really blow up into a whole hour-long conversation. But unfortunately, we don't have that much time today. However, I'd love to have you come back on the show and let's have that talk.
Absolutely. Anytime. I'd love to.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Peter.
Thank you. And you have a good weekend.
Again, the book is called Free Refills. You can read Dr. Grinspoon's story. And if you want to find him on Twitter, he is at Peter_Grinspoon, GRINSPOON. Doctor, thank you very much.
So that was a great interview with Dr. Peter Grinspoon. I really appreciate his honesty and his forthcomingness. It's not typical of doctors to speak so openly about their problems and their issues. Our next guest is actually, she's a 15-year-old student from Maryland. And I met her when a mutual friend, Dr. Janella Chin, introduced her to me as a possible intern. And I realized in about 5 minutes that this was an extraordinary student because on her own accord, she decided to research cannabis, the medical aspects of cannabis for a high school project. And against the will of her teachers, against the administration of the school, against a lot of odds, she really stuck with the topic, not because she's a user, not because she's an advocate, not because she's political at all, because she really wanted to understand what is medical cannabis and why is it illegal? Why is it a problem when people who have a substance that can heal are barred from using it? What is the logic of that? We began talking about this months ago, and every time I spoke to her, I was just more and more impressed that a 15-year-old would have the purse capacity and the perseverance to do this and present it to her high school colleagues and friends and fellow students and the administration. And by the way, get really good grades for a result of doing that. So, I would like to introduce her because I actually think she's one of the better spokespeople for the legalization of cannabis. And for another reason, in that she has no vested interest. She was just curious. So let's welcome Iran Mosiak from Maryland and hear what she has to say.
You can like and follow the Brave New Weed podcast on all the best social media platforms. Find us on Facebook at facebook.com/bravenewweed or on Twitter @bravenewweed or Instagram @bravenewweed.
Matthew, I want to introduce you to Iran Mosiak. She's a 16-year-old student in Maryland, in Howard County, Maryland.
Okay. Nice to meet you. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Iran, tell us, I met you through Dr. Chin, who's my medical director, the medical director of Medical Cannabis Mentor, and you've done some interning for us, some work with us. But tell us how you got involved in the world of cannabis and when you began. At what age did you begin all this?
Absolutely. So actually, I got involved in my research through a program we have in my high school called Independent Research. This class is basically where you get to pick a topic and research it for the whole year without basically very limited parameters about what kind of assignments you have to complete. As long as you're kind of progressing in your research and turning stuff in, it's basically all up to you. So at the beginning of the year, when I started my research in September, I had this kind of like big dilemma. What the heck am I going to research? At first, I thought I was going to do like assisted euthanasia, which was a big topic in the news. But then I realized it was only legal in a few states and there wasn't much information and data about it out there. So I was back to square one, essentially, in like October and November.
Okay.
Yeah. So So I kept reading in the news because doing a topic that was relevant and kind of current was really important to me. You know, other kids were doing cancer and other topics that were repeated year after year, but I really wanted to do something new that other students haven't done before. So, you know, my family and I actually, I don't know, every time a medical marijuana state or a recreational marijuana state gets legalized, like, I don't know, we would always, like, that's something we would always bring up at dinner.
Why is that? Do your folks use marijuana? Or are they particularly interested in the topic or not?
I mean, they're totally for it. Like, my parents knew about it a lot more than I did before I started my research. And, you know, I saw the topic come up more and more in the news. So then they suggested it to me and they were like, oh, why don't you do this as your topic? And I was like, oh my God, this is a really great idea. So I looked into it and, you know, I kind of started.
So what was your topic? Was it legalization? Was it medical use? Was it history? What was your topic?
Right. So everybody was kind of doing like a medical perspective from the topic. So I thought that I would be doing that too. So November through January, I did the medical kind of aspect, like the endocannabinoid system, CB1 receptor, CB2, really trying to understand how it worked. And then after January, I realized like we had to do a survey or some sort of data collection, and I realized that I couldn't do that. So I turned to kind of looking at statistics and legalization, that kind of thing.
I see.
It was like half and half.
So when you finished your well, first of all, was the school in favor of your doing this subject? Did you have any obstacles, any pushback?
So when I started, my teacher's like, she basically thought I was advocating for recreational teen use when I told her about this topic. And I'm like, no, that's actually not what I'm doing. So yeah, I mean, there was a little bit of like, I guess people were uneducated. So they thought I was researching something and like advocating for something that I'm really not. But once I was able to kind of explain what I was really doing, it was okay.
Mm-hmm. I guess at this point we should ask: Are you a user, or have you used the plant?
No.
Okay, and I hope that was okay. And so your interest was not in recreational teen use, correct?
No, absolutely not. Why would somebody do that as a school project?
I don't know. That's what I
know a lot of people in school that if they could have got away with that as a project, they would have been
done that.
All over it.
They would have loved that. But so other than that one teacher, what did the students think of what you were doing?
So a lot of the students were actually into it when I did my classroom presentations, mainly because they thought I was doing like a teen recreational use project. So when I would come into the room and, you know, put up my PowerPoint, everybody would be so excited, like so hyped up. And then I would get into like the science and everybody would be like, okay, I don't care anymore.
Well, did anybody find it interesting? Were people not interested in the topic in your high school?
Well, so once the hype kind of died down and people realized that it wasn't like teen recreational use, a lot of people were not interested. But then I did have some friends that were also in the research program that were doing kind of different topics like diabetes, different types of cancer. They found it really interesting because honestly, nobody has done this topic at my school before. And there's usually topics that get repeated year after year after year.
Mm-hmm. And by the way, what kind of a school, what is the name of your school and what kind of a school is it? Is it a private or a public high school? Tell us.
So it's a public high school, and it's called River Hill High School.
River Hill, is that right?
It's public.
Yeah.
River Hill Public High School. Okay, so you did the research. You spent a year doing the project, pretty much, right? A school year, anyway.
Pretty much, yeah.
So what was your takeaway from it? What did you learn? What did you think when you were done with it?
You know, I realized, yeah, sure. So I realized there was a lot of misconceptions about medical marijuana, like what people use it for. Like I read a little bit about like synthetic marijuana, that kind of thing. I think it's really beneficial, and it's a shame that more states don't legalize it and it doesn't become like a nationwide thing, because it could help a lot of people. Like I started my research with the Charlotte Figge case that I'm sure you guys know about. And
of course.
Well, tell the listeners what it is. We know about it, but please tell people what it is in your words.
So Sure. So I did my research mainly related to epilepsy because medical marijuana, is effective for different types of conditions, ailments, whatever. So I was looking specifically at drug-resistant epilepsy, which is what Charlotte had. And based on what I read, over the drugs that she was getting, prescribed by doctors weren't really working for her, and she had like it's something crazy like 100 seizures a day. So then they eventually, So eventually they, I believe they actually moved to Colorado and started getting her onto the CBD formula, which actually helped her stop her epilepsy and seizures.
Okay, so you learned that it was effective for certain medical conditions. What else did you learn? What did you think about the laws? Did you look at the history of prohibition? Was that of interest to you? And what did you think about it?
Honestly, I'm a little bit like ashamed to see kind of like that some states are still not legalized, because it's 2018, people. We're trying to be like as progressive as possible and do as much good for the country as we can. So if it's obviously helping people, why won't we just legalize it everywhere,
Oh, man.
Well, you must have asked that question to people. Did you ask lawmakers? Did you ask people in power? What did you ask them? Did you go to any conferences and talk to people in the government? What did you do? Tell us.
So, I did classroom presentations. I did some presentations outside of school at a learning conference. But honestly, a lot of people don't take students our age seriously. So it's really difficult to get somewhere with your research, especially at this age, which is really unfortunate because, if you listen to people our age, a lot of them really know what they're talking about and are pretty smart.
I got one for you then. I want to know, because you have dug in, let's get really nerdy for a second. And I want you to pull something out that you've discovered in your research that was shocking or surprising for you that might also be shocking and surprising for our listeners.
Well, see, I'll just talk about CBD and THC because, I don't have my notes and everything. But I just thought that it was interesting that people didn't really know the difference. And, when people are taking CBD extracts, oils, whatever it is, it doesn't actually have the psychoactive component. So you can't really get high off it. That was something I had never known before. And that's actually a big misconception about medical marijuana that, most of the people in my community didn't know, like when I took a poll and kind of saw the results.
It's quite a bit different information than what they would teach you in like a DARE class, right?
Yeah.
Did you have anti-cannabis education in your school? Did you have to do DARE program?
Actually, so I've never really heard of the DARE program, but everyone in Howard County is required to take a health class, and they always say they say that marijuana is a gateway drug. So, there's that.
Wow, they're still peddling the gateway.
Yeah.
They're still talking about the gateway drug, huh? Mm-hmm. Amazing. But
Gateway.
Maryland does have a medical program now.
They do.
So I want to know, though, did you talk to people in power? Did you go around saying, hey, I did this research. What's your opinion about this? Did you talk to any lawmakers? Did you go to any, civic or public places and talk about things? Because you're not exactly shy about this topic, are you?
No, but honestly, it's like I mentioned before, it's really hard to get out there as a student. There's not that many opportunities like where I live to go and kind of talk about and be taken seriously. That's the biggest problem. But the Student Learning Conference, which is a conference in Howard County for kids our age to present their kind of research, I did have a board there with my research kind of just summarized. And I did have people walk up to me and kind of ask me what I thought, what my take on the topic was. And even adults came and asked me like, oh, why do you think it should be legalized in more states? Kind of asked me about misconceptions, that kind of thing.
What's your answer to why you think it should be legalized?
If it helps more, if there's obviously research that shows that it's helping more and more people, why wouldn't you want to help those people? I don't know. That's really it.
It's pretty basic, isn't it?
That's such a just a truthful
Just
and
such an
simple
obvious
statement.
and an obvious statement, right?
Yeah.
Why would you not want to, right? What would the point be? So, what did your folks think of all this as you were doing it, and once you presented it? What did they think? Were they pleased? Did they think it was interesting? What? Tell me.
Yeah. My parents, they've always been really supportive of my research throughout the year. And, I always talk to my parents, they're like, what do you think about this? Like, I always had them kind of proofread my work, make sure it was good. I would actually they would tell me stuff that they saw in the news, and we would talk about it. And I would be like, oh, guess what I learned today? So it was a really nice way to kind of start conversation. Yeah, they were always really supportive, to be honest, which is a good thing.
And are you still involved in cannabis in some ways? Now that you've done your presentation, you've done your report, presumably you got a good grade. What'd you get? What grade did you get, by the way?
I got an A.
Nice.
Why am I surprised? But are you still
I am
involved?
not surprised,
Are you
right,
still
John?
involved in the subject, or have you moved on to another subject?
So actually, I'm not in the research program this year because I wanted to do we also have another program called Intern Mentor where you intern on site, but I can't drive yet. So, I didn't want to make my parents drive me every day to an internship because that's just cruel. So I'm taking a year off, and then next year, hopefully I'll be able to find an internship near where I live. But I definitely want to continue with this topic. Like, I'm not going to stop and try something new because I'm really passionate about this, and I definitely want to continue.
Yeah, that's a curiosity that I had. Obviously, we're in a place now to where the legal cannabis world is exploding all around us. There's 1,000,001 opportunities out there. We were just speaking about an article that was talking about jobs available for cooks to make tasty edibles in the cannabis world. That might be a little bit of a narrow thing, but out of curiosity, with your research background on this now, is there an area of the cannabis industry or world that you would like to get more involved in, or like you see yourself tracking toward in the future?
Yeah, definitely. So I'm really interested in political science, and I think advocacy, especially for medical marijuana, is something that I would be interested in the future. The problem is that there's not that many opportunities out here, so actually finding something that's worthwhile is pretty difficult.
And just following up on that, if you are staying active and in the political and advocacy space, share with us some of your resources. When you go to dig around and do research, where are you pointing your browser? Where are you sourcing all this information?
I use mainly when I'm looking for articles, I usually use Google Scholar, which always comes up with plenty of up-to-date articles. Google Scholar is really narrowed down and has very credible sources, so that's where I usually go to look for articles. And obviously just reading the news, anything that's going on in mainstream news. What
was the name of your presentation?
The name of my presentation was really I think it was something like shocking facts about medical marijuana, public common misconceptions. I really started off with the beginning of my presentation really emphasized the kind of troubles that Charlotte Figge was going through, and I kind of tried to make the audience feel bad for her, and then kind of really tie that into the research. So I really started off with imagine that your child, your child has 100 seizures a day, and there's nothing that you could do to help them. What would you turn to? Would you turn to alternative medicine? That's how I always started my presentation with.
Great, very good. Is there anything else about the topic of cannabis that you found particularly surprising or interesting that we haven't talked about, like legalization or the history? Did you read about the history of cannabis and the history of prohibition?
No, I didn't really spend much time on history. I try to be as current as possible, and I kind of started with okay, when was the first medical marijuana states legalized? Okay, what kind of bills are they passing to get these legalized? That kind of thing.
I see. Good. Have you read Brave New Weed?
I started reading it, never finished.
Oh, that's heartbreaking to hear.
No, I'll finish it.
Sorry about that. I'm sorry it disappointed you.
I promise.
Oh, no. Don't say anything. I get the message. Don't worry. I'm trying not to take it personally, but I've been heartbroken, really. What did you say?
She's been busy. Joe.
She's been busy.
In life of a teenage girl, there's a lot going on, and especially one as dedicated to a topic way outside of the sphere of influence of that world, which is the legal cannabis world. I mean, that's like, I don't even know. When I was 15,
Just
taking
amazing.
on an astrophysics study program or something, just way out of bounds for what you would expect of someone your age. I think it's incredible.
It's extraordinary. I think good for you for doing it. And I wish I could have been in the room, and I wish I could have seen the principal's look on his face or her face. And did other teachers attend that presentation that you gave, or was it just your class and classmates?
So at the countywide fair, there's a lot of teachers there. Basically all the GT research teachers in the county, and they're kind of walking around and they come and talk to you, that kind of thing. But when my teacher saw me present this topic for the first time, she was pretty shocked. I remember her looking at me from across the room.
That's a pretty good one.
That's pretty great. Iran, I'm so glad you spent some time talking to us about this today. Matthew, is there anything else you'd like to talk about?
Just to say that, you know what, keep going, keep working at it, and don't let anybody dismiss you just because you're of your age. Don't let anybody dismiss you because you're a girl. Stand up, stand your ground, and stick to it, because you definitely deserve to be listened to.
I think this is a person who is not going to let anybody intimidate her out of what she thinks is the right thing to do.
Absolutely. And if you have problems with that, anybody like taking knocks against your credibility ever again, just tell them you were on our show.
Thanks so much for joining us. We'll speak again, okay?
Thank you.
So listeners, I want to come clear with you on a very important topic. You know, Matthew and I have done this podcast for almost 2 years now, with really for no material gain whatsoever. As a matter of fact, it costs us money to do this podcast, and we've been doing it on our own just to spread the word, to bring the topics to light, and the response has been overwhelming and gratifying. People listen in, we get emails all the time. People are urging us forward and to continue, and we're going to. It would really help us, however, if we could get a little more support from the listeners who listen to this podcast on a regular basis. I mean, I know it's hard to pay for content. I know it's not normal in the way we're used to getting everything for free. But at the moment, we're not advertising. We're not beholden to anyone. We may change that over time. And we really depend on those who are listening to us to help support us. Now, if you're struggling with money, if it's an issue for you, this does not apply. Please continue listening. Take it for free. Spread the word. No problem at all. But if you can afford a little bit, a monthly, $1, $3, it would really help us to continue this work. We're doing it because we believe in it. We're doing it because we think the topics need to be raised. We're doing it because we're not hearing it from other people. There's a lot of industry forces coming in. There's a lot of people with things to sell. Cannabis is being commoditized. We're not selling products. We're not doing that. We're talking about information. We're trying to expand the breadth of knowledge about the plant, about how we use it, about the benefits of it, and obviously about some of the difficulties of using it. And we'd really, really, really appreciate your support. So I'm not going to bang on about it. I'm not going to ask a lot. But if you can, please go on to patreon.com and consider supporting us so that we can continue doing this and bringing you what you want to hear. Patreon is patreon.com/bravenewweed. Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to the Brave New Weed podcast. This episode and all future episodes are made possible by amazing listeners like yourself. If you like what you've heard, we encourage you to show your support by giving $1 a month for special access and rewards on patreon.com/bravenewweed. You can also follow us on Twitter and Instagram via @BraveNewWeed. Find us on Facebook at facebook.com/BraveNewWeed. And remember, you can always find more information about us or information discussed in each episode by pointing your favorite browser to bravenewweed.com.